I'm supposedly an expert in propaganda, but there are big gaps in my knowledge. So I've done an interview with Ben Thomason on Syria, a long interview on assassinations with TJ Coles, and you're the third in this series for my channel, which is Scourge of the Spin Machine.
That's good, yeah.
So why does this social media side of propaganda matter so much? And have there been changes recently that have made that even more significant?
The reason social media matters so much is because we're all on it. You know, in times gone by, the New York Times could boast of having X hundred thousands of readers, or the BBC could say, we've got this many million people tuning into the nightly news. But something like Facebook dwarfs the power and reach and influence of these kind of operations. Facebook has 3.1 billion monthly users. That's this kind of reach that these other networks that existed in the pre-internet era could only dream of. So their influence and therefore their power to shape the way we think about things, to promote certain agendas, to demote other ones, to basically decide what we see, read, and hear is on a scale unimaginable before the internet. And that's why I'm so interested in it. And that's why I had to start critiquing it. I did this originally for my PhD when I was basically trying to update the propaganda model of Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, which was written in the 1980s, talking about the power of TV networks and newspapers. And it became clear that in the internet era, perhaps some of those ideas might be a little bit outdated. I don't know. What I found actually was that the propaganda model holds even better for social media. And yeah, that's why I think it's so important to really drill down into who owns these social media companies, who works at them, what kind of connections they have to state power, to foreign state power, what their agendas are, how algorithms affect us in ways we don't even realize sometimes, and how perhaps the internet is not quite as free as many people think it is, or at least it was promised to us back in the 2000s.
Yeah, so I guess that's where my assumption for a long time was that there was, I think it was called net neutrality, wasn't it? The idea that basically there isn't really a bias. The internet is just a system that basically works fairly and is just a communication network. And I guess it was probably maybe 10 or 15 years ago that I started hearing these discussions of bias and control behind the scenes. And then the Twitter files came out a few years ago. How bad is that, though? I mean, it is annoying sometimes. You know, we all do it. We all post a comment or something, and then it disappears. Or, you know, I put up a photograph of Hitler once in a pair of shorts, and and Facebook did me for nudity. So there's all sorts of these things that happen like that I think we've all experienced. But how bad is that, and how systematic is that, and how political is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you're of a certain age, you'll remember the time when the internet was this place where there was an enormous amount of promise. People thought it was going to open up societies, create amazing peer-to-peer connections all over the world. It was going to solve problems. It was going to lead to a new era of harmony. It was going to bring in a more democratic libertarian system across the world. Authoritarian governments were going to fall. And it was this sort of incredible technology that was pushing against sources of power. That, however, was always just the marketing. In reality, the internet, if you read people like Yasha Levine's book, Surveillance Valley, the internet was actually developed by the US military as a tool of surveillance from the get-go. In the wake of the Vietnam War, the United States launched an incredible campaign of surveillance across the country, penetrating all sorts of different activist groups, all the way down to tiny church groups with like four old ladies in them. One of them would have been, some FBI informant. And they had reams and reams and reams of data about all of these people, but they couldn't actually put any of this together because it was all in paper and it was all in different offices all over the country. And what the FBI realized was that if they had any sort of way of just amalgamating all this data into one central source where where people and anywhere in their network could actually access this, they might have actually been able to shut down all the protests that led to the United States backing out of Vietnam, and they could have actually ended what they called the Vietnam syndrome, which meant that the US public's aversion to a genocidal campaign in Southeast Asia. So that's really where the internet came from. It came from military funding. It was originally called the DARPA net, and the D in DARPA, it stands for defense. It's a government institution which still exists to this day. And that's really where the internet grew out of. And, in the 1980s, it started spreading to universities. And then in the 1990s, it really hit the public. And we like to think of these big internet companies like Facebook, like Google, like Twitter, or whatever, the big ones, as these sorts of institutions which kind of exist and don't exist. They kind of just exist in the ether. They're like, supranational beings which don't really have any allegiance to any kind of government or anything. But that's actually not the case whatsoever. These companies, for the most part, are brick and mortar companies which have headquarters in California or Texas now, and they abide by American laws. They are staffed by Americans, and they are under the influence of the American government. And just as an aside, that has really become very clear with the US government's hysteria over TikTok in recent years, whereby they see this Chinese owned app, which is starting to beat the American apps at their own game. And they hate this idea. They hate the idea that another government, or at least an entity that is not completely under control of the US government, could actually be influencing billions of people in what they see, read, and hear, or what they don't see, which is very important. Now, it's very important to actually look at these companies, the Facebooks, the Twitters, the Googles, and actually look where they came from and who's actually staffing them. Now, if you think about it, Facebook is the biggest distributor of the news that has ever existed. As I said, 3.1 billion people use that platform every month. And almost all of them are getting some form of news there in their newsfeed. And for many people, Facebook is their number one source of news. That is the truth for billions of people around the world. So who actually controls the algorithms which decide what news you see and what news you don't? Well, that's where my research has come in. And what I found was in the past 8 years or so, social media companies have been going on a hiring spree, hiring literally hundreds of agents from the CIA or other three-letter agencies of the US government or the US State Department to control their algorithms and work in their most politically sensitive fields. I found hundreds of these agents just using employment databases like ZoomInfo or LinkedIn, whereby all you need to do is type something like Facebook CIA into LinkedIn and see what comes up. And what does come up will shock you. Let's take one example, Aaron Berman. He is the face of content moderation on Facebook. He is ultimately in control of what everybody sees and what he doesn't see. He is the person who, for example, pulled the trigger on banning Donald Trump from the platform after the January 6th insurrection. Now, as I said, he appears in many public-facing videos for Facebook. He's very often wearing these like lovely pastel-colored jumpers, and he talks a really good game about how he has to strike this fine balance between content moderation and free speech, and how it keeps him up at night, and how it's very important for Facebook to be completely open about what they're doing. But Aaron Berman is not completely open about who he is because he is a CIA agent, or at least he was until 2019 in June, where he left his job as one of the highest ranking members of the CIA and was parachuted in to the top echelons of Facebook to become the head of its content moderation team. He was so high up at the CIA that he was actually writing the president's daily briefs, the intelligence briefs for Obama and Trump, basically advising them on, which countries to bomb. And there are dozens, if not hundreds of people that I've been detailing in great length in all of these investigations I've been doing over at Mint Press News, talking about how many of these people are actually now in control of these social media companies. A good example of this of how the US government and Silicon Valley really intertwine here is what happened after the death of Qasem Soleimani, who was an Iranian general who was assassinated by the Trump administration while he was actually on his way to have peace talks with Saudi Arabia, which the United States did not approve of. Soleimani was executed. He was the most popular man in Iran, according to US polls, which found between an 80 and 90% approval rating in Iran of this guy, mostly because he was the driving force that destroyed ISIS in the Middle East. Yeah, as Trump assassinated him, and yet because Soleimani was the head of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, which is officially a terrorist organization by the US government's standards, any sign of solidarity or support or opposition to this assassination was illegal under US law. And that applies even for people in Iran speaking in Farsi to other Iranians on platforms like Instagram, which a third of Iranians use. So Meta, the parent company of Instagram and Facebook, was forced to delete hundreds of thousands of comments in support or of Soleimani or in opposition of Trump because it broke US law. That's the sort of power that we are handing over to the US government when it comes to these things. And last example I'll give you on this is Google, which some people don't think is a social media company, but it's an enormous driver of news. Everybody's looking at, Googling stuff to find out stuff which happened. Google News is an enormous platform. You can't get away from Google. Even if you don't want to, there's basically no alternative to it. Google started in the 90s as more or less a CIA project. Sergey Brin's PhD thesis, which would eventually, which he did at Stanford, which eventually would turn into the research that started Google, was not only funded by the CIA, but was actually overseen by an active duty CIA agent at the time. In fact, the CIA had shares in Google until at least 2005, we know. Google Earth and Google Maps, that incredible platform that allows you to look at your house or any house all over the world, or maybe a foreign military base if you want to. That did not come out of a civilian application. That came out of a US military. This is the civilian version of a US military platform, which it uses to spy on people all over the world. So we can see from this that there are incredible interlocking links between the US national security state and big social media platforms, which affect everyone's lives, even if you don't use social media very much. And that is why we really have to be cognizant of what is going on here and critique power when we see it, because social media companies are not your friend. They are gigantic, multi-billion-dollar corporations which influence how the world sees things. And for that reason, they represent some of the most powerful institutions in the world today.
Wow, what an incredible answer. Thanks very much. Let me just make a couple of comments and see how you want to spin off them. First of all, I think it's been quite well known as just sort of a factoid that the Department of Defense was behind the creation of the internet in the 1960s. But I had no idea that the purpose of it was so intrinsic to political control from that point. Do you know how? I suppose I'm wondering. I wonder how conscious that was. Whether they were thinking in the sort of 1960s or early 1970s, oh, we can really sort these protesters out in about 20 years when people actually start using this thing, or whether it was already a very useful tool of surveillance for the little old ladies that you're referring to. I was interested in what you said about Soleimani. That's incredible that that Meta was able to shut down hundreds of thousands of comments about the assassination of Soleimani. But aren't the Iranians just able to move to a different platform entirely, and so it doesn't necessarily matter? And just as an aside to that, I was wondering if you had any comment on, they often talk about Soleimani not going to Saudi Arabia for peace talks, but for some other nefarious reason. I wonder how sure you were that Soleimani was actually, I've heard both sides of that, and I didn't quite know which one to believe. I suspect you're right, but I wondered if you had any comment on that. Don't worry if you forget any of my three vague points there. But did you have anything? Please feel free to talk for as long as you wish.
Right. So for the first one about the early days of the internet, this is not my speciality, but I'll tell you what I've read. Yeah, I mean, I guess the people who are working on this at places like Stanford University, the academics and scientists, knew what was up, and there were enormous protests from the people in the know about this at the
Oh,
time saying that we don't want to be involved in something that is a mass surveillance tool, which is going to be used to cut down on free speech, break American civil liberties. We don't want to be part of this. Now, I don't believe for a second that the US Defense Department knew exactly what the internet was going to turn into many decades in the future, but they saw this thing as a very useful tool for different departments of the United States national security state to talk to each other, to share information, and to start the early days of digitizing information to get machines in on the job to do
sounds like
things that
ID
humans
cards.
can't do.
Sounds like ID cards, Alan.
In terms of Iran, and you say, well, can't you just move to another platform? That is, of course, in theory true. But we all know why we're on certain social media platforms. And the reason is because everyone else is already there. And so you would have to have an incredible coordinated shift to get all sorts of people off of these social media platforms and onto another. And that is really the sort of model that so many of these new businesses are trying to get, which is you start by being the first into the market and you try to basically become a monopoly. This is what Uber is doing. This is what all these sorts of apps that let you like rent your home like Airbnb is doing. The point is that once you're on these sorts of things, there's basically no alternative. There might be some, tiny place off on the side, but you're not going to be able to, if you move to some tiny thing that tiny social media platform, you're not going to be able to speak to your aunt who's not going to change. You're not going to be able to see what your cousin is saying. You're not going to see what your favorite journalists or media personalities who are on these big platforms are saying because they're on there because everyone else is on there. And it's kind of a self-perpetuating thing there. So yeah, that's a difficulty there. Um, so with the people of Iran, yeah, I mean, there are efforts in certain countries. I think China is probably the country that saw this coming a mile off and has done the best job of protecting itself with its so-called Great Firewall and just creating Chinese alternatives to American platforms. And there are, other countries. I know Venezuela, for example, is trying quite hard to wean itself off American social media with, limited success. But yeah, it's difficult when once a behemoth emerges, you can't really ignore it. And finally, on Iraq and Soleimani. So yeah, the Iraqi prime minister at the time made a statement that he had invited Qasem Soleimani to Baghdad, which is where he was assassinated, for peace talks with Saudi Arabia, which would have, potentially ended those sorts of, well, maybe ended is a bit of a strong word, but certainly led to a détente in the hostilities between
Right.
Iran and the Gulf monarchies. Now, the Prime Minister of Iraq said that he had actually asked permission, which is an interesting phrase to use. He had asked permission from Donald Trump to invite Soleimani there in the first place, and Trump had said, yes, that's fine. And it was at that point that Trump used that information to drone strike Soleimani and kill him. So I think to me, it seems pretty clear that he was there for peace talks because the peace talks had been arranged and the president of Iraq, who is the highest, apart from, of course, the people in Washington, the highest power in the land, has come out and said, yes, that is why he was here. So for me, it seems kind of open and shut that that is indeed what was happening. Now, I know that people like Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence made statements to the contrary, but, I think, quite frankly, those people Pompeo famously said, I was head of the CIA. We lied, we cheated, we stole. That was in our DNA. So, I
Mm.
take what Mike Pompeo says publicly with a large scattering of salt.
Mm. Yeah, that's so interesting. And just as an aside, away from social media for a second, that's one of the things that really disturbs me about Donald Trump is I know everyone has a problem with Donald Trump for 1,000 different reasons, but the real overt deception that he engages in when he arranges for negotiations and then kills the people that he's arranged to negotiate with. I find that really disturbing. It's kind of beyond any kind of normal cynical statecraft. It's monstrous, and very indicative of a very peculiar personality. I don't know if you have any comment on that, but maybe that's just my interpretation.
Yeah, particularly bloodthirsty. I mean, he's done that with Hamas, hasn't he?
Yeah,
Iran, and
Iran.
I would say that nowadays, if the United States starts talking about negotiations, that's a great sign that you're about to get bombed.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, it reminds me of the Red Wedding episode of Game of Thrones. If anyone's ever seen that one. Um, the okay, so thinking about social media, there's obviously some real cases there of massive political control. But how systematic do you think that is in a range of other political issues? Does that actually, to what extent is it actually controlled? A range of different things controlled on a sort of day-to-day basis, or is that kind of left fairly free?
What sort of things do you mean? Just like comments
Well, I
or?
mean, you were talking about particular, like quite specific national security issues. You know, you're not allowed to talk about a particular assassination, but is it that you're not allowed to talk about? Are there moves? How restrictive are those moves by those not content creators, content controllers, I suppose, gatekeepers, um, and also, I suppose the other part of that question is how important just because hundreds of these guys come from the CIA, and I think you've said in the past a lot of them from the DoD as well, isn't it just that they're good at that kind of thing? That they're not necessarily there employed as part of a national security state for political reasons. They're just good at communications and management and stuff like that. To what extent are their roles actually political?
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess it depends. Taking your first point, I guess it depends on the issue. Um, If you are Chinese or Russian or Venezuelan or Nicaraguan or Iranian, the chances are that your account, and if we should say, and your political outlook does not match with the one that Washington is putting out, the chances are that your account is probably just going to get completely banned. We saw this in the case of the 2019-2020 Hong Kong protests, if you remember those. Um,
Hmm.
whereby Twitter came out and just publicly stated that they had deleted around 100,000 Chinese accounts from Twitter that they said were, I think their phrase was something like parroting the Chinese government line or something. But, they weren't saying that they were controlled by the Chinese government. They made
Mm.
no suggestion of that. They just said that they were agreeing with the position of Beijing
Mm.
and they were Chinese people. And that was enough to get them completely zapped from the internet. We saw this again, for an example, in the 2020 Nicaraguan elections, whereby Facebook came out and about a week, I think it was 9 days before the Nicaraguan elections, they deleted dozens of pages and profiles of some of the country's leading investigative journalism outlets, social media outlets, and political figures, all of whom supported the left-wing Sandinista candidate against the US-backed right-wing candidate, one of the Chamorro family. So if you're from a country that is really targeted by the US government, very often the censorship is utterly blatant. And this is the case everywhere. Tens of thousands of Russian accounts have been deleted, tens of thousands of Iranian accounts. If you're a Westerner, that doesn't really happen to you. But very often you are subtly suppressed. If you keep using words like Palestine um, or hot button issues like this, you will find yourself algorithmically suppressed, and that's certainly happened to the place I've worked at, Mint Press News, which has lost over 99% of its Facebook uh, what's that word? Yeah, the clicks and
Reach,
likes and
impressions.
interactions from
Yeah,
Facebook, yeah.
interaction.
And over 90% of our Google search traffic has gone down as well. So that's the sort of soft censorship you see. You're not actually zapped from the internet, but for the Department of Defense or the US government more generally, they get 90 something percent of the censorship, what they're looking at, what they're looking for, but almost 0% of the public pushback because the things haven't been actually banned. They've been, soft censored. Um, I want to touch on a point you were talking about there when you say, oh, these mandarins that come into big social media companies, aren't they? Isn't it just the case that they're, really expert in their field, they're really good at it? Well, I guess that could be argued for some of the people who do have experience in this, and it certainly would be the case for a lot of the people I've found who used to work for the Israeli military's most controversial cyber warfare unit, Unit 8200, who now there are hundreds of those people working in Facebook, in Google, in Microsoft, in Amazon, in Twitter, etc. But I don't think you can really make that case for a lot of the people I was looking at. Scott Stern, for example, who worked at Facebook, I think he still does work at Facebook. Don't quote me on that, but he was a CIA targeting an analyst, and he was basically head of targeting in the Middle East to make. And if you're thinking, what does that mean? Does that mean like the guy who's like, deciding what weddings in Afghanistan get drone struck? Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. And then he goes from that job to working at social media, identifying online threats. It's very suspicious. Or an even better example of this is Jessica Ashu, who is more or less the head of Reddit, which is one of the largest websites, and if you want to call it social media, you can, but the largest online message board in the world. At one point, a couple of years ago, it was the fourth most visited website in the United States. Now, she, for many years, worked at the Atlantic Council as a Middle East specialist, and in that role, she was particularly specializing in the dirty war in Syria, where she was coordinating different factions against the government of Assad, flying all over the Middle East as an employee of Washington, and then later of the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's think tank. And she was coordinating the responses to the Syrian civil war from the West. Now, we also know now that the United States was spending, what, $1 billion a year funding and training Al-Qaeda and other radical Islamist forces to try and overthrow that government. So we know what the United States was doing. And Ashu there was also at one point the advisor and a direct employee of the foreign minister of the sorry, not Ukraine, the Emirati foreign minister. She was his assistant, more or less. So she was actually working for the government of the UAE and also for NATO's think tank. And she suddenly gets parachuted in to become the head of Reddit, the director of policy, with no relevant experience whatsoever in social media, absolutely nothing. It's impossible to look at that and say, well, she is just the most qualified person for the job because she had, as I said, no background in social media, none in content moderation, nothing of that. It was utterly blatant that this was a deep state Mandarin being parachuted in to take over Reddit. And almost immediately we saw her banning more than 100 subreddits, changing the face of changing the character of the entire platform. So yeah, I mean, if you look for this sort of thing, it's everywhere. And it's also happening in old media as well, because you might remember Dawn Scalici. She was a 33-year CIA veteran who suddenly one day was just appointed to an executive role in Reuters. And in her press release, where she was announcing this, she said, I've been sent here to you know, what was it? She said something like, I've been sent here to fulfill the various needs of the US government. It was just extraordinary, like that she would actually say that. And it's just utterly blatant. But so few people are actually looking for this stuff, even though it's out there. And so few people are actually reporting on it that, most people just shrug their shoulders and say, "Huh, well, whatever."
Wow, that's all so interesting. I guess why do you think they're so afraid of all these accounts that are just putting out words on the internet? I mean, it's not exactly, not every comment on Facebook leads to a massive street protest, let alone a government overthrow. Why are they so scared of it?
I've actually, just as you were talking, I'll tell you exactly what Don Scalici said. She said when she was, yes, she was parachuted into Reuters. And she said her primary responsibility as global director of Reuters was to, quote, advance Thomson's Reuters ability to meet the disparate needs of the US government, end quote. Yeah, so why are people scared of it? I mean, of course, most comments that, say, yeah, down with the government or whatever leads to nothing. But that was the case in the pre-online days as well. Most people who were meeting for a face-to-face meeting, talking about how the government was rubbish or how we should change society. 99.9% of those things never went anywhere. But it is the case that sometimes one thing can just spark something and it leads to an enormous nationwide or even continent-wide protest that leads to governments being fallen. The Arab Spring started with a little street vendor protesting in Tunisia, and that exploded into multiple countries overthrowing the government. So it can happen, and the government is aware of that. Speech is powerful, or at least it can be. So yeah, it's very important to keep a tab on that. And governments, for time immemorial, have done this. It's just that we are living in a different way in which this new medium of communication has opened up. And so we're seeing the same kind of policies being implemented, but in a new arena of communication.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. Where do you think we should go now with this discussion? We've got about maybe 20 minutes or so to go to hit the hour.
Mhm.
We could talk more broadly about propaganda and communication. I'll probably cut this bit, or we can. Or is there more to say about social media? I think you've covered that so well. Um, or maybe particular case studies, particular countries. What are your main
Yeah, sure.
concerns? I mean, why? I guess you probably agree with me, really. Why do you oppose the what the U.S. government's trying to do? All they're trying to do is a little bit of control around the world, keep things in order a little bit. What are your main concerns? Your main international politics concerns and domestic politics concerns at the moment? Oh, and I suppose another question I was going to ask you as well was about this. Wasn't there some takeovers by the Ellison family the other day that I thought might be relevant? Have you followed that? Oh,
So I can explain on that.
you've just got your volume just went for a second there. So maybe I could ask you. I'll probably cut that bit and just say just a couple of points. But one, I was wondering what your major concerns were internationally and domestically, and why this matters so much. And also as an adjunct to that question, there was some news the other day about the Ellison family becoming some kind of taking over various media companies that sounded very significant, but I didn't read into it as closely as I should have done. I was wondering if you had any comment on that.
Listen, ultimately, the media is pretty much the arbiter of what is true and what is false, what is possible and what is impossible. It sets the agenda for different societies about what we should be talking about and what should we be discussing politically. So, quite frankly, I agree with the great Armenian American scholar Ben Bakdikian when he said there is no more powerful force shaping society than the media. And if you're interested, if you are a critical mind, you have to look at power and scrutinize it. That is what we have to be doing. And if power is illegitimate, we have to be undermining it and dismantling it. So, why are we interested in looking at social media? As I've said, the sorts of power that the BBC and the New York Times had in days gone by, they can only dream of the kind of reach and influence that big social media behemoths like Facebook or Amazon or Google or Twitter or insert big social media company that you want to talk about. as these things have, in a matter of just a few years, percolated down to every facet of society across the globe. You know, if you go to a village in rural Thailand, you will see people on TikTok interacting with people. If you go to, you know, the high mountains of Bolivia, you will see people, you know, talking to people on Facebook. They've got friends there. You know, I went to Dharamshala in India and saw these Tibetan monks who are followers of the Dalai Lama. They were all on their latest generation Samsung phones, scrolling through Instagram. I thought they would be, you know, praying 6 hours a day and just, you know, sitting like this. They were scrolling like everyone else. We're all doing it, right? And
Different kind of followers.
people and the institutions who have the power to decide what you see on your phone have incredible influence over how you see the world and what you think about and what you think is possible, impossible, what you want for your life. I can barely overemphasize how important this power is. And recently, we're seeing the amalgamation even more of state power and media power with Larry Ellison's bid to become a media oligarch. Now, it's already the case that basically all the top 10 people in the world, in terms of their wealth and power, are already media owners. You look at Elon Musk and how he owns Twitter, or Jeff Bezos, how he owns the streaming platform Twitch and the Washington Post, or, you know, Bernard Arnault, the French Louis Vuitton billionaire who owns seemingly half of the French media as well. But now it's Larry Ellison getting involved. And yeah, you mentioned him. Ellison and his family have completed the purchase of Paramount, which owns CBS News, which is one of the largest networks in the United States and one of the most influential in terms of their nightly broadcasts. Their show 60 Minutes in the United States is really the flagship investigative journalism outlet, television outlet anyway, in the US. And they're also in pole position to take over to take over TikTok as well. Now, why this is important is, number one, where does Ellison's money come from? Larry Ellison is this world's second richest individual. A lot of people don't know who he is because he owns Oracle, which is the world's fourth largest tech company. Again, a lot of people don't know Oracle because it does not sell to consumers. What it mostly sells is gigantic cloud software and tech and databases to governments and to big institutions. Now, Oracle is a CIA project. Larry Ellison got his start working for the CIA. In fact, Oracle is named after Project Oracle, a 1970s operation, a CIA operation that he was working for. And for the longest time, Oracle, his company, only had one customer, and it was the CIA, until until Oracle started bidding on 4 different contracts with different 3-letter agencies of the US government. And so that's where his money comes from. He is basically the private face of the US national security state. In the 1970s and particularly in the 1980s, the CIA and other 3-letter agencies started outsourcing a lot of their operations to nominally private companies in order that they didn't get as much scrutiny for what they were doing in places like Vietnam or Cuba that they did before. Ellison, of course, has maintained his close connections to the US government ever since then. Oracle is one of the largest defense contractors in the entire world. They constantly sign these multi-billion-dollar contracts with the Department of Defense, with the US military, etc. Also, very important is Ellison's extremely close relationship with the government of Israel. Ellison is the largest private funder of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. A lot of people are not aware that the IDF is actually funded partially from abroad, from private donations from very rich individuals. There's a charity called Friends of the IDF in the US, which Ellison is deeply involved in. In one day in 2017, he gave them a $16.6 million grant. And the Friends of the IDF basically raise money to to provide all sorts of services and equipment for the IDF when they're fighting. And Ellison and others, they organize these gigantic galas in places like Hollywood and Palm Beach, which are headed by Hollywood megastars like Gerard Butler or singers like Pharrell Williams. And they raise enormous amounts of money for the IDF there. Ellison also offered Benjamin, he's a real disciple of Benjamin Netanyahu. He flies Netanyahu across the world so they can holiday together on Ellison's private island. Ellison offered Netanyahu a seat on Oracle's board. He also employs Safra Katz as the company's COO, Katz being an Israeli. And when Oracle employees started, making some noise about, Oracle's incredibly close relationships with the state of Israel, Katz came out and said, listen, Oracle has a dual mission to help the US and also to advance the goals of the Israeli government. And anyone who is uncomfortable with that should just leave the company. That's what she said. And Larry Ellison has backed up this statement from Katz. So it's very clear that what Oracle is. It is a tool of the U.S. national security state, and so for that company to now be controlling CBS News, which, as I said, is arguably the United States' most important old school legacy media outlet, is deeply, deeply worrying from a free speech perspective. Even more so the fact that they have now announced that Barry Weiss is going to become CBS's editor-in-chief. Now, Weiss is a career propagandist for the state of Israel. She first came to national attention while still at college at Columbia University, where she created and co-founded an organization which basically went after Arab professors and tried to get them fired if they were not if they did not display enough fealty to the state of Israel. And I believe in some cases she was actually successful in that. She parlayed that into different jobs in Israel, where she got some top jobs in big Israeli outlets like Haaretz, and then she came back to the New York Times and became a columnist there, which is basically like being on the Supreme Court of the media. It's like a job you can never get fired from. It's like an incredible sinecure. But yeah, her outlet, the Free Press, which quite frankly is very little more than a Substack blog, was bought by Ellison for $150 million. And she was ensconced into this role as editor-in-chief of CBS News. And the Financial Times itself specifically reported that it was her positions on Israel which swung the deal for Ellison. So this is an overtly political hire in the milieu which we've seen in the last 2 years, where the American public have really turned on Israel, particularly young people, specifically because they are seeing on their phones constantly video after video of babies being exploded and hospitals being attacked, schools being leveled, etc., which has really hardened the American public to Israel. And that is a massive problem. As ADL chief Jonathan Greenblatt said, we have a TikTok problem, meaning Israelis have a TikTok problem. And they are trying to solve that by having Ellison buy TikTok. And as I've been talking the last few minutes, he is extremely close to the Israeli government. He's, you could say he's, one of Benjamin Netanyahu's closest, friends and backers. So for someone like him to be coming in to be purchasing TikTok, we all know why this is happening. It's because TikTok, for the longest time, was offering something of an alternative view of the situation in the Middle East. And for the US empire, that's a real problem because Israel serves as the 51st state of the United States. It serves as often quoted as an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East, which helps the United States control the most stupendous prize in all of world history, as the Roosevelt administration called it, the oil of the Middle East. Because whoever controls the oil of the Middle East basically controls the world economy. Without oil, you cannot farm. Without oil, you don't get electricity. You don't have any transport. Entire economies would just shut down if we didn't have oil. So whoever controls it and profits from it is given incredible leeway to actually uh, design the framework around which the entire global economy um, uh, circles. And that's why the United States has been so interested in controlling the Middle East over the last 50 to 100 years, because it does give them this enormous power. And because they found such a willing lieutenant in Israel, Israel is awarded incredible leeway to do whatever it wants around the world, assassinating people, carrying out genocides, bombings, what is it, 6 or 7 countries simultaneously right now. That's the sort of thing that if you're a Mandarin in Washington, you have to support because of the greater project, which is the control over the world's most important resource. And so all of this, what I've been talking about, Larry Ellison, TikTok, CBS News, this is all rolled into ultimately control over the world's economy, over how the world functions. And so, yeah, it's a big picture situation, and uh, we have to be clear-eyed and take a step back and really understand what is going on here, because it all fits into this one global narrative about how society is actually going to function.
Wow. Yeah. That's all brilliant. There's just so much there. I think, let me think of a sort of a question that we can perhaps tail into the end here. What's the role of the left here? Is there is the left any use at fighting against this? Is this internet social media project mainly a right-wing dominated thing? Because I think a lot of people think that the left is involved in social media in some way, but is it able to actually do anything to challenge that, or has the left kind of been co-opted into this kind of Blairite kind of liberal left, identitarian politics or whatever, that that sort of means it's part of the problem? That was, again, a very poorly phrased question, but I hope you got my gist. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Listen, I think again, I guess it depends on what country you're talking about. If we're talking about the Western left versus, say, the Chinese left or the left in Latin America, it's going to be a very different conversation, isn't it? Um, yeah, ultimately, I think if you are someone of the left, you have to realize that you are fighting on a very unequal playing field when you're on social media, because these big social media outlets are not your friends. Um, they are some of the largest corporations, international conglomerates, which have ever existed under capitalism. And so anyone coming along trying to change the system of capitalism and say, we should break up these companies, you're not going to be welcomed onto Google or YouTube or Facebook or Instagram or whatever. So you better be ready to have your content suppressed or even deleted, which is what I think pretty much if you speak to anyone on the left who's been on social media for a long time, they will have stories about being deranked, demoted, delisted, or even deleted. So you're fighting an uphill battle when you're on these platforms. So I would say the first thing I would say as just a word of advice is don't, emotionally invest in this, because it could be taken away from you at any point without even, an explanation. Having said that, uh, as I said, for the we were talking about earlier, these social media platforms are unfortunately where people are. So if you do want to reach people, it is an obvious place where you would start. It is an avenue of success, or at least in terms of you can in theory reach millions of people with your message. So not being on these sorts of platforms is perhaps not really it's not really just it's not a solution. You can't do the Benedict option for the left like you can with these like weird right-wing Christian groups. You can't just pull yourself out of that and say, well, we're not going to fight on social media, we're not going to have a presence there. But I would say that, you know, this is a very old saying, but you're a like on Facebook is not the same as a handshake in real life. You know, a friend on Instagram is not the same as a friend that you have in real life. And there's no substitute for actually organizing face to face, because that is a way in which you reach people in a much deeper way and make much more profound connections and more important organizational ties than you're going to do by just posting out something saying, oh, hey, you know, this is what I think, and, you know, producing an infographic on Facebook or whatever. So I would say organizing on social media is absolutely no uh, substitute for doing it in real life. And it's okay if you want to, you know, post something on Twitter saying, "Hey, we're having a meeting here. Anyone who reads this is welcome to show up," or whatever. That's fine, but don't confuse social media with real life, because ultimately it's in the streets where things are actually changing. People are spending more time online. So if you do want to reach people, it can be an easy way to get there. It's very hard to give a general answer to your question because, of course, as I said, it does change. It does. It does really change the different sort of societies you're in. I wouldn't, you know, come and insist on, you know, talking to someone in, you know, as I said, in China or Latin America and give the same answer. But perhaps for the West, that's the answer I would give. Yeah. Oh yeah, of course.
Okay.
I didn't answer one thing you said. You know, is the left co-opted? Is well, yeah, that is definitely that is the goal of the government, whether it's the US, the UK, or any of the other governments in the West. That is their role to try and defang all of these movements. And we've seen, you know, a lot of radical movements being, as I said, defanged, like you know, the LGBT movement, which started off as extremely radical in the 60s and 70s, talking about how, you know, landlords were not welcome, you know, as part of, you know, in these spaces, or, you know, you know, a gay cop is still a cop or whatever. But now, you know, you see a lot of pride marches and they're sponsored by, you know, ridiculous companies like financial companies, or, you know, sometimes you even see like companies like Raytheon getting in on the act and saying, you know, we're an incredible LGBT friendly employer, even as we're like, you know, bombing LGBT people across the world, etc.
Mm.
So yeah, you do risk there is a risk of being co-opted by the government, but you have to fight against that. And certain movements have been more successful than other movements at doing so. But yeah, of course, the government is going to try and co-opt you and try and turn you into, you know, a cheerleader from Empire, or like at least a sort of quiet mascot for that. That is incidentally, I think, um, they tried to do to Greta Thunberg for years. You know,
Oh
they
wow, yeah.
welcomed her into the halls of power and said, you know, hey, you can, this is the life you could have. You could, you know, sit on some board, you know, you could be on some foundation and, you know, cut a very nice check for yourself and live in luxury. But she, to her credit, has refused that and decided
Mm.
that she has taken climate activism to its logical conclusion, which is to start looking at the system of capitalism, which itself is driving the climate crisis. And we're accelerating towards a cliff because of this mantra of infinite growth on a finite planet. So hats off to her for that. And also hats off to her for also opposing the genocide in Palestine and putting her life on the line, and actually being arrested and tortured by Israeli prison guards as she was doing it, and using her celebrity to draw attention to the less fortunate in the world and to try to do something about injustice, rather than, as I said, just become a sort of co-opted mascot for imperialism.
Yeah, absolutely. I read about the very serious maltreatment of Greta Thunberg and the other people from the flotilla just this morning. It was horrible. Not a very nice way to wake up to read that sort of vile behaviour. So yeah, that's been so. The answers that you've given there have been so interesting. I think we will try and keep it to an hour. But could you tell us a little bit about your writing? Any books that you might have that people should read? Uh, Anything upcoming that you've got coming out? Just a little bit about yourself so that I can stick links in, or you know, whatever.
Yeah, well, I guess I started off as an academic, which is where I found your work, and I was particularly interested in the media itself, and I ended up doing a PhD about sociology and media studies, and I was intending to become an academic, but uh, almost completely by accident, I landed in the world of alternative media because
Yeah.
I did write a couple of books, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting, and Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent.
Yeah, very good.
Out of those, which you appear in Propaganda in the Information Age, out of those, yeah, I ended up writing some articles for alternative media websites, which were basically plugs for those books. But those sorts of those things kind of snowballed into writing a bit more in alternative media. And at some point, I thought, I'm, making some, making some sort of waves here, so maybe I should continue. And ultimately, the last 6 years I've been working at mintpressnews.com. You should check them out there. And I'm very lucky to be able to write in-depth investigations into really critiquing power, whether that's state power, corporate power, media power, anything like that is what I'm interested in really exposing. And I guess what we've been talking about in the past hour has really been the culmination of the writings that I've been doing over the past few years, whereby I've been looking at the links between the fourth estate, the media, and the national security state, and how those things are increasingly intertwined. So you can find all that writing at Mint Press News. You should also follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Instagram. I'm at Alan R. MacLeod at Twitter, alan.r.macleod at Instagram, and if you type Alan MacLeod into Telegram, it will be there as well.
Yeah, well, that's been absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much to you, Alan MacLeod. You've been speaking to Matthew Alford at Scourge of the Spin Machine for the latest in this installment of episodes about propaganda, areas of propaganda that I should know more about, and now I certainly do. Thank you ever so much for speaking to us today.
Great
I'll
to
pause
see you.
this.